Welcome to In Conversations with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the latest developments in Canada's ongoing foreign interference inquiry, including Prime Minister Trudeau's surprising claim that both Liberals and Conservative parliamentarians have been compromised by foreign sources, and what this all means for our democracy, politics, and national security. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We're speaking on October 22nd, precisely 2 months from the U.S. presidential election, David. And though I promised to get to foreign interference, I have to ask about a podcast that you recently did with The Dispatch, in which you set out the conservative case against Donald Trump and in favor of supporting Kamala Harris. It's a compelling listen that I'd encourage our audience to check out. I won't ask you to summarize your entire case here, but let me ask you, is the best argument for Vice President Harris that she's not Trump, or is there an affirmative conservative case for her?
The best argument for Vice President Harris is that she's not Trump. Yes. Look, I don't think that there should be any blinking that Harris is a product of Democratic Party politics, answerable to Democratic Party constituencies, someone who veered quite far to the left in 2019, 2020 in a way that she finds embarrassing today, obviously, and tries to evade, but won't disavow. Yes. And if the Republicans had nominated Mitt Romney or some other responsible, constitutionally minded free market person, obviously, any Republican person, any conservative person would prefer that. The problem is the Republicans have nominated someone who tried to overthrow the Constitution of the United States, who rejects the concept of American global leadership, is hostile to NATO, will betray Ukraine, has made that very clear, as opposed to confiscating Russian state assets to fund Ukrainian reconstruction, is a protectionist, and is just generally a thug, bully, creeping weirdo. I keep quoting this line. I forget now which Sherlock Holmes mystery it comes from, that Holmes explains how you solve a difficult problem: eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the right answer. So I don't have to make a big whoop whoop about Vice President Harris. Again, she's what she is, and there's nothing wrong with what she is. It's not what I am, but there's nothing wrong with being what she is. I very much hope that it will be possible to cast a conscientious conservative vote against her in 2028. But right now, we have this urgent problem that the Republican candidate tried to overthrow the Constitution by violence. I don't know that I need to say a whole lot more to make the case for the alternative.
If I may follow up, if Trump loses, do you believe, David, that the Republican Party's center for gravity is back up for grabs, or has he changed the party in a way that makes it less palatable for you and others on a more permanent basis? Maybe to put it differently, would a Trump defeat change the incentive structure in the party?
It would obviously be hazardous to answer that question with any degree of confidence.
Yes, indeed.
Everything will depend on the exact shape of what happens in 2024. It depends on whether Trump loses by a little or by a lot. It depends on whether he takes down the Republican majority in the House of Representatives with him. It will depend on whether he leaves the scene in reasonably good order, or whether he tries again to overthrow an election by violence. So there are a lot of imponderables here. But it will be one of the most important questions for the future of Republican politics. If Trump loses, does the future belong to free enterprise, collective security actors, people like Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, or is Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, and the sinister cabal of foreign-born billionaires behind him, are they the future? And is the Republican Party permanently on the path of this mysterious relationship to dictatorships all over the world? I don't know the answer to that. I hope it'll be the former, but anyway, today's decision, I think, is very straightforward. I came into conservative politics in the 1970s because I believed in markets, because I believed in trade, because I believed in collective security under U.S. global leadership. I still believe in those things. And Donald Trump does not, rejects them. J.D. Vance does not, rejects them. So my dearest commitments are all pushing me away from the place where I spent most of my political career. I wish it were otherwise. One last thing. There was a piece of research in the Financial Times recently that purported to show that U.S. CEOs were moving to the left. You may have
Hmm.
seen this.
Hmm.
And when you look more closely, what they did was they analyzed donations by CEOs over the past 20 years and have shown that those donations have shifted from Republicans, and especially the most conservative Republicans, to more moderate Republicans and to many Democrats. And you think, well, one way to read this is that CEOs are moving to the left. Another way is to say the CEOs of today are more or less the same, or thinking the same as the CEOs of 15 years ago, but they're confronted with a Republican Party that has moved away from enterprise markets, global trade, and U.S. leadership. And of course, they're adjusting to their environment. And the big story has been the shift in what Republicans believe. And Donald Trump is campaigning on returning to the uh, protectionist policies of the Herbert Hoover era. Well, obviously, well-informed people have to reject that. That's a stupid, stupid, dangerous idea. And so if you have a vote to cast against it, cast the vote. If you have a check to write against it, write the check.
David, thanks for indulging me. I couldn't resist the temptation not to ask you about, as I say, what is a must-read podcast. And as you just outlined, these are issues and questions that no doubt you and I will take up in
Yeah.
the coming months after the November election. But I'll turn now to the subject we were going to discuss,
Yeah.
which is the ongoing inquiry into foreign interference in Canadian politics. For those listeners and viewers who haven't been following closely, the Hogue inquiry was launched just over a year ago to investigate these allegations, and it wrapped up its public hearings last week. It has heard a lot of claims about efforts by foreign governments to influence Canadian political outcomes, including through direct efforts to shape our local elections. Um, Before we get into some of the details, why don't I just ask you, what's your
Yeah.
big picture reaction to what we've learned through this exercise?
I want to line up 5 data points
Please.
and start drawing conclusions from that. So data point one is Canadian intelligence agencies began sounding the alarm about Chinese state interference in Canadian federal and provincial politics as long ago as 2019.
Yes.
At every turn, the Justin Trudeau government has tried to suppress this information and protect the people at whom the intelligence community's finger was pointed when the interference was from the Chinese state. That's data point one. Data point two is the Indian state seems to have plotted assassinations on Canadian soil as their reaction to Canada's long indulgence of Sikh terrorist fundraising on Canadian soil. And the Indian state seems to be deeply implicated in murders and attempted murders on Canadian soil. Now, suddenly, all the inhibitions against publicity that were there on the Chinese side have vanished.
Yes.
And the Trudeau government has gone out way ahead of its Five Eyes partners, from whom it got much of this information, the United States and Britain. And as we have just recently learned, gave an interview to the Washington Post where they disclosed classified information, again, having tried to suppress classified information in the
Yes.
case of the Chinese state. So their policy on India is exactly the opposite. So that's data point two. Data point three. We have Hezbollah and Hamas activity on the streets of Canadian cities in ways that are certainly suggestive of foreign connections. And this activity, much of it theoretically illegal, declaring support for prohibited foreign terrorist organizations, has been
Yes.
met with somewhere between government indulgence and a kind of government support, and endorsing at least many of the claims that
Yes.
these protests were. So that's the third data point. Fourth data point is the Trudeau government, which has been so reticent about Chinese state interference, so forward-leaning on Indian state. Just last week, Prime Minister Trudeau himself was testifying before the committee, and with no evidence, named a Canadian citizen, Jordan Peterson, the eminent psychologist and public intellectual, about whom very controversial figure. Different people have different views, like him, dislike him. That's free society. But named him as the recipient of suspicious Russian financial backing with no evidence, and just put it out there.
Yes.
Fifth data point. Uh, Canada, like most democracies, has rules about how long you may live outside the country's borders and still
Yes.
cast a vote.
Yes.
Um, that one of the big initiatives of the Trudeau government was to abolish all time limits on how long a Canadian citizen could live outside Canada and still retain voting rights in a Canadian jurisdiction. I testified against this change when it was proposed on the grounds that many Canadian citizens live in jurisdictions where they are subject to extreme pressure, Hong Kong being the obvious example. And that when you say you can be out of the country for 30 years, you can have no domicile in Canada, but you can still vote in Canada. What you're doing is opening the door to pretty alert attention to the possibility that hundreds of thousands of votes will be cast by people whose livelihoods, whose family members are subject to intimidation, harassment, retaliation, violence by foreign states. So I want to put all of these things together to say it adds up to the picture of a government and a political system that just will not take this problem seriously in any terms other than crass short-term political advantage. And it's really important that Canada develop, we've talked about this a lot, not just a national security culture, but a counterintelligence culture. Counterintelligence is different from policing. Look, if Jordan Peterson is taking Russian money, that's not illegal. But he doesn't, and it presents some kind of problem. That's for sure. If it's true, and there is absolutely no reason to believe that it's true, no evidence of any kind has been given in support of this highly defamatory and damaging claim. But there's a difference between things that are illegal and things that are a problem, and different responses. You cannot punish people for things that are not illegal, but you can also safeguard your political system against things that are not illegal, but that are nonetheless dangerous. And that's why most societies have both police forces and intelligence services and counterintelligence services under three separate headings. And Canada just seems to have a bunch of politicians who say, is this foreign interference good for us?
Yes.
Like the Chinese interference was. Is it bad? Can we use it? Can we weaponize it as trying to mobilize Sikh votes against India is? Are we trying to straddle the middle here, as they do with Hamas-Hezbollah activity on Canadian streets, where we're trying to, win votes from both the pro-massacring Jews community and the anti-massacring Jews community? And then finally, the government that seems to, it looks like, just taking petty revenge against a critic of the government by using the security and impunity of national security allegations to throw out a damaging personal claim against somebody without more. So maybe the ultimate response here is a democratic one, which is it needs to be an issue that someone says we need a proper national security culture in Canada that takes things seriously, but also says if an individual citizen has done something that is improper but not illegal, that person does not forfeit privacy and legal rights.
Yes. Just a brilliant answer, David, and a good segue, incidentally, to a question I was going to pose to you, because, as you say, the Prime Minister's comments are a reflection of a deeper problem that we've discussed on this podcast, which is the politicization of foreign and national security policy. You've set out some really interesting options in past episodes to try to create institutional incentives for a greater soberness on these issues, including the appointment of former national security officials or military generals to the Senate to effectively create a Canadian version of the Vulcans in Washington who focus on these types of issues. But I have to ask about Canadians themselves. I in a previous question, I mentioned the incentive structure within the Republican Party. Isn't the biggest problem here the incentive structure for Canadian politicians, rooted in the basic fact that Canadians seemingly don't care about these issues? How do we get to that core of the problem?
Well, it's a bigger problem than Canadians not caring. When you say you can live outside Canada for 30 years in a jurisdiction that doesn't have a democratic government and cast a vote in Canadian elections, when you say we are encouraging all kinds of immigration without any regard to the values of the people who are coming, and without any requirement that they form overwhelming and exclusive attachments to the country they've adopted. When you say the government of the day cannot set standards, and saying chanting support for foreign terrorist organizations it may be illegal, and even if not illegal, will certainly be harshly condemned by every political authority.
Yes.
That when you make a point of pride that Canada's post-national, well, okay, Canada's post-national. This is what post-nationality looks like. You have important constituencies inside Canada that owe their loyalties outside. You have a Sikh community, which is continuing to raise funds, on an apparently large scale to commit terrorist atrocities inside India. And Canadian governments look the other way, as they did in past years from the Tamil, as they have done with the supporters of Hezbollah, because they're particular ridings that are important to the government of the day. Multiculturalism began as a way for governments to direct patronage funds to voters. That there'd be a radio station that broadcast in foreign languages, so the government put a lot of advertising on that radio station. They might get, better coverage and maybe some votes from the Italian or Portuguese community. So it began in a kind of grubby, but maybe ultimately harmless way.
Yes.
But it has become an incubator of violence and national security danger. And again, what India seems certainly to have done, I'm not 100% certain, but seems probably to have done in Canada, is an appalling breach of comity. It's a crime. It deserves the harshest measures. But it also follows from the Indian authorities' bafflement as to how did Canada become a safe haven for the fundraising for terrorism inside our borders? And why won't you listen to us when we try to reproach you and ask you to do something about it? Again, murder? No, obviously not. But what else? The Indians needed some kind of response, and they never got one.
To that point, David, if it's not politics that's going to change the culture around national security issues, one wonders if geopolitical interests may be a way to push things in a better direction. And in that vein, what, if any, consequences are there in your mind for Canada-U.S. relations if American policymakers come to see Canada as susceptible to foreign interference?
Yeah. Well, Canada could meet the fate that New Zealand has met, which is, it's called Five Eyes because it referenced the wartime intelligence sharing between the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. But New Zealand long ago proved itself so unreliable and so unhelpful that although they're by courtesy part of Five Eyes, it's really Four Eyes. Yes. And it could be three. It could be three. Because if you're untrustworthy, if you don't contribute, then the people will be very careful about what they share with you. And if you have Chinese state penetration of caucuses and even cabinets someday, that's something that your partners are going to notice. One last thing that needs to be said about the politics.
Please.
When the so-called freedom convoy, the truckers and the anti-vax people who shut down traffic in Ottawa, and I had, as you know, we've discussed about this. I come from I believe in law enforcement. I don't care what your cause is. You can't park a truck in the middle of the street. And I didn't think much of the cause, but it didn't matter what I thought of the cause. You can't park a truck in the middle of the street, and you certainly can't park it there for 2 weeks. Yes. And there does seem to have been a lot of evidence that at least the message was amplified by Russian state media. But how do you get people even to be ashamed of that when the government is so indulgent of other forms, when it's pick and choose, when if a form of foreign interference is congenial to the government of the day, then it's green light, and it's only a red light when it's not congenial to the government of the day. One of the ways, if it's true that a prominent Canadian is receiving funds in a way that is not illegal from a foreign government, that if true, that's a shameful fact, and shaming would be a response to it, but not if the shaming is selective and obviously partisan. And that, I think, is what happened very much with that convoy, is they didn't care that they were their messages were being amplified by the Russians, because at some level they knew if their messages were being amplified by the Chinese, that would not be an issue. Or if they were parading with slogans of terrorist movements that are important to the government's hopes in Montreal, that wouldn't be a problem. Theirs was a problem. So you need cultural codes, and politics here, I think, can be a standard. But it begins with affirming some idea of Canadianness, and that means, and that goes back to our other hobby horse here, which is not lodging false accusations against the country's history, not defaming the country's heroes, not taking their names off universities and bridges, not toppling their statues. That if you destroy the resources of nationality, you have no antibodies against anti-nationality.
Let's wrap up by looking ahead. As I mentioned, David, the inquiry is now complete. We're
Yeah.
anticipating a final report sometime before the end of this calendar year. I mentioned that we're speaking on Tuesday, October 22nd. It's possible even this week, Prime
Mhm.
Minister Trudeau could find himself
Yeah.
forced to resign as Prime Minister because of
Yeah.
internal Liberal Party pressures. Just project forward. What do you see coming out of this process? What do you think its impact will be on Canadian politics? Is there reason to believe that it may be something of a forcing mechanism to
Yeah.
effectively compel our political class to start to take these issues more seriously?
I think with so often with politics, there are issues where people don't care until they do.
Yes.
Um, and it's surprising. It's never surprising what people care about, but it's surprising the timing. That when's that train arriving? When that train's arriving, whoosh, the train is here. I think a lot of this has gone to the general perception of the prime minister as feckless, irresponsible, selfish, petty, uh, and um, and willing to use any tool for any reason without much regard for anybody's interests other than his own. That this is all sort of consolidating, um, and and I think it's one of the reasons that his own party is so fed up with him and is looking for some way out. But as I say, we need to some degree to think there are institutional safeguards. You mentioned my pet idea about having a dozen senators who are just appointed almost as of right. I mean, maybe if the guy's a particular failure in the job or the woman is a particular failure in the job, there's some way not to make it completely as of right. But there's some presumption that the former head of CSIS becomes a senator and so on. And there also needs to be some Canadian equivalent of the intelligence committees in the U.S. Congress, where
Yes.
the party leaders are read into information at the highest level with some deep understanding that this information won't be shared, that it's not police matters, there are no prosecutions here, but you need to know that this person whose support you are seeking is somebody who is compromised. That's just, and there's nothing anyone can do because it's not illegal, but you need to know that. And as a
Yes.
patriotic leader of an opposition party, you will not want to be mixed up with such people. Um,
Yes.
and whether that's the Conservatives and the trucker convoy, whether that's the New Democrats or the Greens and some of their Hezbollah buddies, whether that's the Liberals and their too close relationship with China, that there's some way that there's a room where the party leaders gather and they can speak candidly. Say, are you joking? You had that person speak at your convention? You know where they get their money.
Yes. A ton of insight, David. Stringing together a series of different ideas in a compelling way, as you do every couple of weeks. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look
Thank
forward
you.
to catching up soon.
Bye bye. Thanks so much.